Welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about ASP.NET MVC Core using C# and Docker. The specific items we're going to cover are the quick modifications to our sample application, where we're going to create a new local SQL service account for our application to use to connect to our SQL database. We're going to build and publish that ASP.NET MVC Core application to a local folder, and then we're going to actually copy that folder to our Linux machine that has Docker installed on it. On that machine, we're going to also go ahead and create a Docker file that's going to be used to create a new Docker image. And then we're going to use that new image to tell Docker to create a new container and actually start our application. And at the end, we're going to actually test everything is working using that new Docker container. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our sample application that we've worked on in the past videos called the contacts application. And the first thing we're going to actually want to do is make a slight code change to that application because it's actually using integrated authentication, which is only available on Windows. So the change that we need to make is we need to add two new properties for username and password that are going to be used to specify the connection information. So let's go ahead and do that. And those are going to be string properties. They're going to be called username, and the other one is going to be called password. We're going to also go ahead and modify our app settings file that we've created before. And in that settings file, what we're going to do is make some quick adjustments. So first of all, we're going to actually tell the application to connect to a different SQL server instead of using local, which is actually basically saying go ahead and connect to a local instance of SQL Server running on that same machine. We're going to actually specify the host name of that machine so that when we're connecting from that Docker server to this SQL server or the SQL server that's hosted on this dev machine, it's actually going to be able to resolve it by name. Then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to say integrated auth is false, so it's not going to be using integrated authentication. And we're going to add the two properties that we just added to our code in here as a configuration. And what we're going to do specifically is we're going to say use the username of DB, and the password is going to be password123 with a bang. Okay, so this is enough for us to be able to now configure our application to say go ahead and when you connect, start actually using the specific username and password. Now also what we need to do is we need to make a slight code change to how we actually connect our to our database to specifically to the SQL Server using new configuration options. And we do this by changing the unconfiguring method, and specifically what we're going to say is if the integrated auth is set to false, we're going to actually set the connection builder setting to false as well. So we do this by doing a check if settings database integrated auth is false, and we'll do that like this. And then we're going to then say conbuilder.integrated security equals false. And then we're going to do an else if statement, and in this else if statement we're going to say if the username and password are not empty, then we're going to actually specify them in the connection builder, so it builds a proper connection string. So if not string is null or empty, settings database username, and then we're also going to do and not string is null or empty, settings database password. We're going to go ahead and we're going to actually say conbuilder integrated security actually is false, and in here we needed to set it to true. And then in conbuilder we're going to actually specify the user ID property to be settings database username, and that's going to set it to the username that we have in our configuration file. And conbuilder.password is going to be settings database.password. So this will actually allow us to now use the settings file to be able to specify specifically that we want to use the username and password instead of using the integrated authentication under which this application runs on Windows. So what we should be able to do is actually connect to our database, but before we do that, we actually want to make sure that that username and password are actually configured in our SQL Server. So we're going to open up Management Studio real quick and create that account because it doesn't exist yet. So, and the way you do that is by going to the logins, right-clicking here and clicking New Login. We're going to specify the username is going to be database. The authentication type is going to be SQL Server authentication. And we're going to specify password that we put in our configuration file. And we're going to uncheck the enforced policy because otherwise it's going to force you to specify a complex password. Now this is recommended practice. When you do this in production, you want to have a secure password and a complex password as well. And you also typically want to make sure that next time somebody tries to use this password that it's actually changed. Unless this is a service account and then you know exactly what you want it to be, then go ahead and set it to the value you want. The other thing that we want to do is in the user mapping, we're going to actually say that that account has access only to the context application, and we're going to give it data reader and data writer permissions. This will allow us to actually read and write from that database using that account. So now what we should be able to do is, if we again verify in our app settings file that everything is specified correctly, and we go ahead and run this, we should be able to actually see the application start up, and we should be able to connect and see all the records just like we did before. So I just go ahead and started the application. It's building, and the application is starting. And as you can see, Chrome started up and we can see our records, and I can go ahead and click on the name Joe Smith, and I can go ahead and click edit, make my changes, save it, and go back. So we know that the application is running. So what we want to be able to do now is actually go ahead and build and publish this application so we have it available and we can move it to our Linux machine. So the way we do that is we can right click on the context application and click on publish. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to choose a folder that we're going to output to. And the folder I'm going to put it under is under the main context application. And I'm going to create a folder called builds. And under builds, I'm going to create a folder called debug because I'm going to be creating a debug build here. So I did that. And I can go ahead and hit publish here. So in this case, it should go ahead and actually build a debug version of the build and publish the application, which we can then navigate to that folder and see the actual binaries that we can then copy over. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the configuration is actually set to release. This is something that we're going to want to actually go ahead and update as well. So let's do that real quick. When you go to the settings button here, you can go ahead and choose the file system as the publishing method, hit next, and under the configuration tab you're going to hit debug as a configuration. And I also typically choose delete all existing files prior to publishing. This way it makes sure that the files in that same folder where it's actually deploying the application get cleaned up so you have a clean version of that. And then once you did that, you can go ahead and save. And once I save my options, if I choose publish once again, it actually should republish the application to that folder. So it has finished actually the publishing to that folder, and we're gonna go to that folder real quick. And as you can see in this folder, here's all the DLLs that are needed for this application to actually be able to execute using .NET Core. So the other thing, if you take a look here, we have an app settings file, and if you open that app settings file, it should also contain our settings that we put in there during our testing process. So now we're ready to actually go ahead and put this application onto our Linux machine and go ahead and actually go through the process of configuring our Docker file for publishing. So what we're going to do is I actually have a remote console already open to a Docker machine. This is actually running Ubuntu 16.04 stable release. And I'm going to go ahead and log into this machine. And this already has Docker installed on it. And so what I want to do is actually I want to open up my File Explorer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to this machine where it actually contains the application, the build debug folder. So I have a connection already established. I'm going to go ahead to the projects file folder, and underneath that it has context, which is our application, and you can see that I have my builds folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this and go to a local folder on this Linux machine where I typically will keep my projects and things related to the work I'm doing, and I'm going to call it contacts, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that in here. So it put that folder here, and now what I can do is I can go ahead and actually open that up, and I'll go ahead and actually open up right within this folder. So right click and open terminal, and actually put me in the references folder. So I want to be in this debug folder. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call touch, and then I'm going to call touch docker file. What this does is actually is going to go ahead and create a file called docker file that's going to be an empty file. And now what I am going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and open up this Docker file using a Visual Studio Code editor that I have already installed in this machine as well. And we're going to go ahead and actually make some quick changes to this configuration. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually tell Docker to go ahead and build an image inheriting from a Microsoft built image that already has .NET Core installed on it, or the latest version of .NET installed on it. And the way you would do that is I have an example file that I'm using here. So it's going to be referencing a Microsoft.NET, and that's going to be using actually the latest version of that image, which is going to be pulled down directly from the Docker Hub repository. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say go ahead and copy all the files. When it's creating the Docker image, it's going to actually copy a particular set of files and is going to put it inside of that Docker image itself. So since I'm going to be running that Docker creation command from the same folder where the Docker file exists, I'm going to use dot to indicate that pull everything from the same folder that the command is being executed from and copy it into the /app folder. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a working directory, and this working directory is basically what the Docker image is going to use to start the application. So I'm going to specify the /app, which is where the copy command put all the files for the application. And then the next item I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the port that I want to be able to expose. This is how Docker knows which ports that your application is going to be using internally inside of the Docker image itself. And then you're able to, when you create a new Docker container, you can actually redirect those ports from your host, the Docker host, to the inside of the Docker container using a different port. And this way you can have one port on the inside of a container and a different port on the outside of the host itself. So, and the way you do that is you say expose and then specify the actual port that you want to be able to expose. And in this case, I'm going to be exposing port 5000, and that's going to be a TCP port. So then the other item that we need to specify is the actual URL that the ASP.NET Core application is going to be running on. So, and the way you do that is by specifying an environment variable, and then it's going to be ASP.NET Core _ URLs. And you're going to specify the actual URL that's going to be used. So using the plus, you're actually indicating that pretty much any IP address that is in that container and on port 5000 is going to be exposed. And that's what the actual Kestrel web server that ASP.NET Core MVC application is running using is going to actually respond to any URL or any IP address using that port. So in the last command that we're going to specify in this Docker file is going to be the entry point. And this is how Docker will be able to know how to actually start up the application. And the way you do that is by basically specifying .NET, and the parameter we're going to use is going to be the DLL of our application, so which is going to be the context.dll. So creating this file basically allows us to now create a new image for Docker to know about how to actually generate this application, and then we'll be able to start up a new Docker container and get access to the application. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead back to my terminal, and in the terminal what I need to do is now I need to actually build the Docker image using this Docker file. And the way you do that is by saying docker build -t, and what we're going to do is we're going to specify the actual name of the Docker image that we want to build. So in this case I'm going to call it cloud developer : and then I'm going to give it the name of our application, which is going to be contacts. And I'm going to do a dot in here, which is what I mentioned before. When I do a dot, basically I'm telling Docker to go ahead and use this folder to locate the Docker file, and that's how it's going to know where to pull the files to build that image. So when I run this, in this case, it actually, the first step it did was it found a reference to the Microsoft.NET latest image. It then copied the contents of the file or the folder that I'm in already and put it inside of that image under the /app. It set the working directory. It exposed the port. It set the environment variables for the URLs to be used, and then it set the entry point and it built that image. So now if I actually go ahead and run Docker images, you'll be able to see that now I have a cloud developer contacts application or an image with an ID, and it was just built right now. And the size of that you can see is 911 megabytes. So what I should be able to do now is I should be able to actually start my Docker container, and we should be able to navigate to that particular application from a browser on this machine. So the way we would do this is we would say docker run, and we're going to specify I for interactive, T is going to be for the name of the actual image we're going to use, -p. -p allows us to actually remap the port. So if you remember in our Docker file, we actually specified port 5000, but in this particular case, let's say I want to be able to export this application or only make it available on this particular Docker host through port 8080. And this is how you do that. So you basically specify -p 8080 : and then the internal port that the Docker container actually exposed the application on. And in this case, I'm going to also then specify the cloud developer context image name. And when I run this, it will actually go ahead and start up our Docker container. So when I run this, it's going to actually run it in interactive mode, and you can see that it's now waiting for us to actually do something about this. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the browser on this Docker host, and I'm going to go to localhost, and as you can see, I've tested this before, and I go to my application. I should be able to actually see the application show up now. And the first thing we'll notice here is it actually failed. Let's take a look at why. And as you can see, it actually failed because it is trying to use integrated security. So let's take a quick look as to why it thinks it needs to use integrated security. And the way you would do that is you would open up this app settings file. And this app settings file is actually telling it to do false for integrated authentication. So this is actually interesting. So let's take a look at our application once again. And in our context, we can see that if not integrated security, so this is our this is my mistake. So if it is integrated security, then what I want to do is specify connection builder integrated security to true. which is the right way to do it. So, and then else, if it's not integrated security, then we're going to use the username and password. So in this case, I would set the integrated security to false and user username and password here. So when I did that, I can go ahead and actually rebuild my application. And I can go ahead and publish it now. And now that I have it published, I'll go back to my Linux host. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and actually go back to my machine where I had that builds folder. I'm going to copy all the files and go back to my folder where I have the builds as well. And this is on my Linux machine. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite the files and replace all of the files. And here I'm going to actually go ahead and stop the Linux container itself. And you can see that when I run docker ps, that no images are actually running. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and build the Docker image again to make sure it's updated. And I'm going to go ahead and run that container once more, now that the image has been updated. So let's go ahead and try to run that again and see the results of that. And as you can see, the application actually started. So what I should be able to do now is, this is actually running a .NET Core MVC application inside of a Linux machine using .NET Core. Now I can go back. Let's create a new user object, or a new person object, and I'll show you that when I actually run the same exact application on a Windows machine, that is actually connected and talking to the same database without me making any changes while it's actually running. So I'll just create an Ubuntu user. And I'll go ahead and hit create here. And as you can see, I actually created that user. And now if I minimize the screen and I open up on my Windows machine the Chrome browser, I should be able to actually navigate to the Docker. Actually, I need to be using the IP address. So let's take a look at the IP address of that machine. And we'll open up another terminal session. You can see that the IP address of this machine is actually specified right here. So it's 168.1.255. And let's go to 8080. And I apologize. Actually, it's 119, not 255. So let me stop that. And as you can see, I was actually able to, once I use the right IP address, I can actually get to the application now. So you can see that now I'm actually running on the Windows machine itself, and I'm getting the application that's running in a Docker container. Now, if I actually go ahead and start up an instance of the same application using Windows, and this is using Visual Studio, I'm actually connecting to the same database using the same account. So pretty much everything else is the same except the operating system that is being used to actually connect to the application. So if I click on this first name here, you can actually see that I see my Ubuntu user. If I go ahead and edit this information and let's say specify from Windows, and I hit save, and now if I actually go back and open up the other instance of Chrome that I had running on my Windows machine as well, pointing to the Docker host, if I just simply refresh, you can see that it updated with first name Ubuntu and the last name from Windows. So the application, this is actually running the same application hosted on Windows and Linux all at the same time. And just hosted by using Docker or IS Express. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave the comments in the video below. If you like this video, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel as well, and feel free to provide any feedback in terms of any other videos that you would be interested in actually seeing, and I'll do my best to record those. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you soon.